The Susan King Lecture is another lecture that is done annually honoring the life and work of a special HIV researcher. Susan was a professor of pediatrics at the University of Toronto and a pediatric infectious diseases specialist at the Hospital for Sick Children. She was involved in HIV from the very beginning when we first saw our pediatric cases at Sick Kids, and was instrumental in developing the Canadian Pediatric AIDS Research Group, as well as setting up the database that tracks HIV-positive women and their babies. This database is still ongoing and has shown the dramatic decrease in transmission from infected women to their children because of treatment. The lecture today honoring Susan King is by co-presenters Sarah Flicker and Jessica Danforth. Sarah, I have known for many years. We worked together on research with HIV positive youth as part of her PhD work. She is currently at York University, an associate professor in environmental studies, engaged in community development, community-based research, public health, HIV, and focusing on particularly adolescents. Her co-presenter, Jessica Danforth, is the founder and executive director of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, the first and only organization by and for Indigenous youth working across issues of sexual and reproductive health, both in the US and in Canada. Sarah and Jessica will talk about taking action, building Aboriginal youth leadership in HIV prevention using the arts.
There we go. Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking the OHTN for inviting us and to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Mississaugas of New Credit. We're very grateful to be here. And I have a very little person flipping around in my belly right now, so please excuse me. I'm expecting. And a little nervous, maybe. It's a real treat to be here. Almost 10 years ago, at a conference quite similar to this one, Randy Jackson, who I saw somewhere there, and Tracy, oh, he went out? Okay, well, Randy and Tracy and I were sitting around in a lobby of a hotel quite similar to this one, and we were dreaming about how we could find new ways to engage Aboriginal youth in thinking about HIV prevention. And we wrote a proposal to test out whether using arts-based decolonizing approaches might work. And to our amazement, CIHR funded the study, and we became one of the data points that Kathy was talking about of a CIHR-funded study. So we were thrilled. From the beginning, our approach has always been grounded in an understanding of ongoing colonial violence, a deep respect for self-determination, and a desire to work with youth to create real opportunities to connect with their culture while building on their strengths and talents. As you can see, our project is called Taking Action, and we've been going strong for 6 years now. And today I want to tell you a little bit of our story and our background and share some of our findings. But first, I need to tell you how I met Jessica. So we were younger then, we were better looking. Well, Jessica's still great looking. But anyways, it was shortly after we had received the great news about our funding that I serendipitously met Jessica at a sex ed conference. And I was immediately incredibly impressed with her energy, her passion, her commitment, and by the absolutely incredible groundbreaking work that Jess was doing to launch the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. I pretty much offered her a job on the spot. I was like, thank goodness I've met someone who can help me implement this great vision we have. But Jessica, who at the time was wise beyond her 22 years, looked me straight in the eye and told me that if I really believed in youth leadership and engagement, we needed an entirely different model. Her terms were very clear. She would join me if and only if I committed to both her and the real work of supporting Aboriginal youth leaders long term. She wanted to be the national coordinator, not a local coordinator. She wanted to work towards a true leadership position and an equitable partnership. And she wanted to be very fairly compensated appropriately for her time. She wanted support in building her skills and capacity to effectively engage in research work so that she could support and mentor her peers. And she wanted my word that I really meant it when I said we were interested in adopting a strengths-based approach. I was intimidated, I was impressed, and I was thrilled. From our first meeting, I knew that I had so much to learn from Jessica and from other youth leaders like herself. This was decolonization and self-determination in action. This was a young woman who was fighting for herself, for her rights, for her community, and for justice. And it was someone I wanted to support and become an ally to. At the time, I honestly told her that we didn't have the funds to do all the things she was asking for, but I would try my best to fundraise, and here I want to really thank the OHTN, who gave us the supplementary funding to support meaningful youth engagement. Partnering with Jess has been one of the most fun and single best decisions of my career. So I share this story for a number of reasons: to honor Jessica, the OHTN, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, and CIHR, but also, very importantly, to offer inspiration to other youth and community activists who are interested in forming meaningful partnerships with academic researchers. Don't be afraid to clearly articulate the terms of your engagement. That's the best and really the only way to build a solid foundation of trust and respect, and really begin the work of decolonizing our own research practices. So today, Jess and I stand here 6 years later as not only good friends, but co-principal investigators of the second phase of the Taking Action project.
Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah, I just as a quick backgrounder, the unsexy story that she didn't say was that I had zero interest in doing research. I was like, what is that? I did not go to university at all. And, when I did go for, a very short few weeks, I ran screaming for the hills. And Sarah was determined all this time to make me a student, and I still am not a student. But I have to say that I then understood that doing community-based participatory action research, which is the framework in which our project is called in English, is really about doing work for and by our own communities. And I understood that working with Sarah didn't mean that she was doing work for my community, because I would argue that's a lot of research, that's a lot of HIV research that's happening. What it is about her, our relationship, and our role, and that's really the story that we want to share with you today, is the story of knowing meaningful and both consensual allyship. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Because the setting in which we're engaging in HIV research is, I want to stop playing Oppression Olympics. So I want to stop this while you need to do research on our people because we're at risk. And apparently we're just living on Risk Island all by ourselves. We don't know how we got there, but we're just always there. We are then marginalized. We are then called vulnerable. We're then really in need of saving. And that's the statistics that are up here. I mean, they're the statistics that are in every study. We seem to use Aboriginal people as a marker of where we can get funding in dollars, not actually willing to do the work of wellness and health. And so the work that we want to be engaged in is by being accountable ourselves to participating in that, because how you get out of Oppression Olympics is you stop saying it's just you and them. We are participating in each other's oppression. And we need to stop that, and we need to start participating in each other's liberation. And so the way that we understand our research is it's actually about doing transformative action research. That our research cannot exist unless there's transformation in action, and that's hence why this is called Taking Action. So we are going to stop saying things like Aboriginal youth are at risk all by themselves, because we're not at risk all by ourselves. What actually puts us at risk is what you see on the screen. Things like colonization, things like not having access to culturally safe care. And so if any of you are doing research and you continue to say Aboriginal people or racialized people or any other people are at risk, period, you need to stop that, because that's not what's going on. This is what's going on, and if you're going to use the sentence, use your 5 extra words to contextualize it. You can do that. That's something you can start doing today. And you can also start being accountable to that type of research that needs to be done. And so it is moving from not just being, quote unquote, culturally competent to actually being culturally safe. And so if you're not using cultural safety, that's something you should be looking at. Our people shouldn't just be made to feel like people are being competent or sensitive to them, or that they're being like culturally cool. It's about being culturally safe, because we're trying to build spaces where all of our people, especially our young people, are feeling safer. And so this was a term that was developed by Indigenous Maori nurses in Aotearoa in New Zealand, who felt very strongly that we cannot do the work that we need to do in both health promotion, public health, research, HIV, et cetera, without working towards cultural safety. And that should be our marker in which we are trying to measure the outcomes that we want to achieve. And so it lends itself, though, to getting out of this. So the ABC method, which I'm sure how many of you have heard of the ABC method? So does it work? Why is it still a federal government standard, then, that's the way that we need to do our work? It doesn't work, not only because of all the reasons that we know that it doesn't work, but I would argue, and we would argue, that it is colonialism in action. That we are basing a lot of our work on abstinence, be faithful, and use a condom, not just in HIV, but in life in general. You should just not do something. You should just be faithful to the system or the way that things are going, or to Canada. And C, you should just use this one barrier to solve all your problems. It is a legacy of colonialism that continues today. And if we're not saying that colonialism continues today, we are missing the mark on that. Because it does continue today, which is why not just decolonizing research is super important, but indigenizing research is really important. Because the ABC methodology is really based on this, on what I call the industry of Indigenous trauma. So work that's actually being done, not again for wellness or for health, but is predicated, is funded, and exists because people are experiencing traumas. And what is our accountability to that if the work we're doing is because people are experiencing oppression? What's our responsibility to that? What does that mean that every funding dollar that we apply for, every work that we want to do, especially with Aboriginal communities, is because we're oppressed? That isn't decolonizing research. That isn't indigenizing research. That is the industry of Indigenous trauma. And some of the points that I shared here on the slide are, because of our oppression, we do offer very unique benefits to profit over. And we need to start calling and labeling these industries of traumas that exist. I think particularly you can see it in HIV, that it has become, or it has been, an industry of trauma for a very long time. And we can't be exempt, nobody is exempt from that. Just by being in this room today here, we are participating in that industry. We'd like to think that we're not, but we are. And so but that means we can do something about it and think critically about moving our research and our methodologies not based on trauma, not based on oppression, not that our end result should be that we then saved everybody, but that our end result really should look at all of the myriad of things and experiences that people experience. So I know that there's a fancy academic theory for that called social determinants of health. My grandma just says shit for real, like stuff that happens. So always so funny when these theories like social determinants of health and intersectionality, like, yeah, that's like everyone who has many different things going on at the same time. And then academics think they can swoop down and make these nice theories and profit off of that, but that's a whole other lecture. But it is understanding that there are multiple things going on, and that we can't measure, again, the traumas and oppressions of our work to say that our work is then successful or not successful. And so it goes back to, I think, what a lot of the work that we're engaged in is restoration and reclamation work. Understanding that things like talking about sex, things like harm reduction. You can learn a lot from Indigenous peoples about harm reduction. We've been reducing the harm of colonialism for the last 500 years. So to just say that that's about drugs and alcohol, you can talk to us about that. We know all about that. And that's why Stephen Harper is not my best friend when it comes to harm reduction, because you don't even like saying that word. But you can learn a lot from us about that. And so the slide that you have here is an example of that in existence. It's many indigenous nations, not to romanticize and generalize all of us, but for example, we have, I'm not going to just say we had, because to stop referring to Aboriginal people in the past all the time, we have, as in today, many of us still have rites of passage and coming of age ceremonies, which, believe it or not, we did not wait for Christopher Columbus to come teach us about sex. We knew about that, and we know about that, just like we know about harm reduction. But it is so highly romanticized in that cool native thing that used to exist, not a proven academic theory today, that it's not taken seriously. And research isn't being done that utilizes restoration and reclamation as forms of resistance against that romanticization. And that's the work that I like to think that we're involved in today, is about restoration, is about reclamation, but also is resisting deficit-based models of further oppression and colonization. And rather than saying just decolonizing the work and the harms and the oppressions, we need to look at indigenizing. And that's the difference of seeking to include Aboriginal people in whatever you're doing, rather than understanding and utilizing consensually Indigenous worldviews, theories in the work that you're doing. So by that I mean, you never hear people say, we need to go recruit more white men. Where are they? We just need to go to their neighborhoods, offer them an honorarium, do focus groups with them. Where the hell are they? You don't hear that. Or if you do hear that, it's for other reasons. You hear people say, oh, Aboriginal people, we gotta go find them. Where are they at? Where is their hood? Where's their neighborhood? We're just gonna have to go offer them an eagle feather and then, bring them in. That's the problems of inclusion politics, policies, and inclusion-based research. If you have to include someone, they're not there to begin with. They're not in the center of the organizing, the research, the power relationships. So we need to flip that. We need to begin right from the start that yes, we need to decolonize, but we need to indigenize. We need to understand that Indigenous ways of knowing and doing are valid. Whether they are licensed or decided by the academic industrial complex, that's another story. But we have to legitimize and claim our own work and our own ways, saying, we've been researchers for a long time, we've reduced harm, we've taken care of other epidemics, like tuberculosis, like syphilis, other things that are a result of colonialism, and doing HIV prevention, HIV research is no different in the need to indigenize and restore and take claim to the ways that we understand that needs to be done as well. And not just include us or think that if you put a feather on something, it's then Indigenous. So, I'm still up. So where that ends us up in is our Taking Action project, which, as Sarah mentioned, it is a collaboration of Aboriginal youth as actual leaders. And so I don't mean the one Aboriginal youth leader that you get to then say, oh, is a peer, one person. I'm talking about actually hiring, compensating for long-term the entire existence of your project and paying with real money, not fake money, credits, letters money, I mean real money. And actually having Aboriginal youth as co-investigators and co-leads on a research project. And for some odd reason, people seem to think that you have to either be in the academic industrial complex or you have to have a PhD to participate in research, which many of us know is not true, but then that doesn't always look like we're applying that when we're structuring the research that we're doing. So that Taking Action was actually our way to learn that you don't have to do that, and this is one way that you don't have to do that. So Taking Action over the last 6 years has been national. We started to work with 6 Aboriginal communities across Canada in actually hiring, compensating, and working with more than 6 youth leaders across Canada, as well as a national youth advisory to guide our entire work. And it was multifaceted. It was a peer-to-peer model, so it was see one in one community and learn one in another community, and actually hire people in the community to do the work. And so on a day-to-day basis, I think in leading up to the way that that is done, it was a mixed methodological approach. So it used looking at art as a way to decolonize the research and look at things like colonialism and racism as factors for HIV incidence. So not just, again, living on Risk Island all by ourselves, but looking at those very real realities in young people's lives and not having to say, well, we'll wait till you get to university before we talk to you about colonialism, even though you're experiencing it every day. Why do we have to do that? Why can't we have discussions about that and work about that now? Not to doom and gloom or blame and shame anybody, but to make and empower and create spaces for change, to be active agents of change in our own realities. And so that methods looked like, as I said, hiring Aboriginal youth leaders, coordinators, and artists. And I think it's so funny that art is this really new research methodology. Ain't that something Indians have been doing for a long time too? So using art in our own Indigenous communities is not a surprise that that's an effective methodology. And so when we say art, it's not just capital A art. It looked everything from hip hop to painting to dancing to throat singing to theater, so many different art forms, which are all housed on our website, takingactionforyouth.org. And these weren't just research products. I would argue that what they are right now is actual tools that public health, cough, cough, should be using. Public health doesn't need to be funding all these fancy doctors and academics to do work. How about you look at the work that Aboriginal youth are actually doing? How about you fund that kind of work that needs to be done? That's my end rant about public health. So this is an example of what Sarah's going to pick off of now is those products and really those HIV prevention tools that were created out of this project of Aboriginal youth leadership.
See now why I really wanted to work with her? So that's an amazing example. Of the kind of work that youth can do over the course of a weekend. What was amazing about that piece was the way they were talking about HIV by talking about all the other issues going on in their lives, how they're artists, how they're leaders, and used a really positive framework to challenge stereotypes. A contrasting piece of artwork we really just want to show very briefly is this mural created by youth in Kettle Point. Here, youth are used drawing on some traditional symbols to talk about the ways in which they want to fight stigma and show respect and love for people in their community who may be positive as a way of opening up dialogue. And the mural was put up at the health center for many months after the project. And lastly, as just a third quick example, was in PEI, we worked with a Mi'kmaq elder who facilitated a talking stick workshop with youth, where youth learned how to traditionally carve and create talking sticks so that they could talk about the difficult things in their lives, HIV being but one of those topics. So in thinking about this work, we see that youth are taking up HIV in a variety of ways, in ways that connect with their communities, with their cultures, with each other, in ways that challenge some of the industry of trauma that Jessica talked about, to building much more positive ways of connecting. And as you can see here, the youth talked about how it's really important to start talking about the positive things in their community and the strengths. Because lots of people look at art, right? So not only was the process an important process, but it was also about creating products that look different from conventional public health programming, that don't rely so heavily on the ABCs. And it's not that the harm reduction strategies of using condoms or negotiating safer sex never came up. But when they came up from the youth themselves who wanted to ask the questions. And then our conversations were that much more meaningful because they were really ready to receive some of that information and had a thirst for that knowledge rather than it coming from us at the front of the room very didactically. And most of all, it's really important to remember that it's a lot of fun. So if you're looking for a different way of engaging a group of youth, start by having a really good time, and you'd be surprised by how many more youth will come to the table. One of the things that we learned was on Friday night, we always had a couple youth. By Saturday morning, we had more, and by Sunday, they were like, "Where are you going? Why are you leaving? When are you coming back?" Which we took as a real testament to the fact that making it fun, is engaging, and then also does that work of health promotion and taking care of each other. So one of the things we really learned from this project is that we needed to take an Indigenous response to quote-unquote vulnerability or risk. We needed to start with what was there, what the talents were, and really think about fostering ways of developing those talents. And I think for non-Indigenous allies, we really needed to learn how to step back. One of the things that I needed to really take home as a lesson, that the work of decolonization means that I am not the expert in these situations. The youth are the experts, and that means I needed to often sit down, zip up, and let youth stand. And this lesson, thank you. And this lesson is unfortunately a lesson we have to learn again and again and again as academics. And even when I was invited to give this talk, I was so deeply honored that the OHTN wanted to hear about the work we were doing. And I have no problem chatting for hours and hours and hours about that work, but I knew that we needed to create space for the people who were really involved, Aboriginal youth themselves, my partner, my colleague, my friend, and I needed to take that privilege of having the invitation and open it up and say, hey, hang on a second, I'm only gonna do that with my partner.
So I think we're over time as usual, and I think just to be clear, what Sarah's saying is that she got invited to do the talk and I didn't, and so let's just be transparent. So that's the reality of the situation, right? They were asking her to talk about Aboriginal youth research, and I have seen funding proposals, come back saying, why aren't you quoting Dr. Flicker's Aboriginal youth research? I'm like, she ain't done no Aboriginal youth research without me. Because that is both the reality and the severity of the situation that we're in. For all of the equitable intersectional theories and approaches, the application in real life still has to be done. And so what that means is that we cannot call ourselves allies just because we think it's nice. Allyship has to be consensual. It cannot be self-determined. It cannot be self-appointed. It cannot be self-imperialized. That's colonization and imperialism in action. And we could, in a different lecture or talk about the mistakes, because we didn't get to this magical relationship of working together by always being friends and being nice to each other. What we actually need to talk more about to move decolonizing research forward is the mistakes that we are making, that we need to not be afraid to say, this is how we got it wrong, and this is how we have to stop getting it wrong, and this is what we have to learn from. So in closing, we are now moving forward with Taking Action 2. We have 18 new Indigenous youth leaders who we are working on now moving from looking at links of colonialism and racism to activism and community mobilization. And that is, of course, in the face of movements like Idle No More, this year, which have, in the last 2 years, have been started, as well as the Indigenous Nationhood movement. And this is just an ending slide of our 18 Indigenous youth leaders who, yes, we used research dollars to have them at an Idle No More march. And that we cannot do or call ourselves researchers with or by or anything like that if we don't start being accountable to the ways that we reproduce the things that we are against. So we want to say thank you. And we are done now.
Thank you very much. That was great. Hang on a minute. Let them appreciate the wonderful job you did. Yeah. Fantastic. I think you have expressed the thanks that we have to Jessica and Sarah for their wonderful presentation, and it was a terrific learning experience, I think, for all of us. Thank you again.